This is a sermon about the thin place. Oh, I should say before I start the sermon that I've really struggled with this sermon. And it's partly because I prepared it sitting down. And that does something to my brain, I think, that scrambles it a little bit. I've never preached sitting down before, so it's totally new to me. And the other thing I should say is that my radiation brain, as I call it, scrambles my thinking sometimes. Radiation brain sometimes makes me forget words, like when I was rehearsing a sermon, I couldn't remember what that green thing there was. I thought stroller, I thought wheelchair, but I did not think walker. It just wouldn't come to me. And so I'm dealing with radiation brain, and that means that you may hear me repeat something that I already said, or I hope I don't skip something that I really wanted to say. So anyhow, so this is a sermon about the thin place. A thin place is a place where somehow the distance between us and God gets closer and closer and thinner until there is a thin place. Now, we have no power to create a thin place. Only God can do that. I may shock you to say, we are not yet in heaven. This is not heaven. So there is a distance between us and God that we often don't think about. It's the distance of our kind of ordinary, everyday lives. But we're not in heaven, and there is that distance. And only God can close that distance and turn something into a thin place. But a thin place is where amazing things can happen. I have heard two metaphors for what happens when we are in a thin place. One of them is that two worlds are overlapping. Our world and God's world are overlapping. The other is kind of different. The other is the veil between us and God, the veil that poet Malcolm Guite called the daily veil that covers the sublime. That veil is lifted in some way, and we see a little more clearly for at least a little bit of time what it is, what life is really like. In the scripture that Ginny read from 2 Corinthians, it is saying, if you remember, that what can be seen is temporary, and what cannot be seen is eternal. So the veil is lifted, at least briefly, and we see a little more of what is eternal. Now, I don't want to spend too much time trying to define a thin place. I would rather describe it to you through people that I have known. I became aware of thin places in my family's life through what happened to two men. And I think I'll have you put up the picture, or you who are in the sanctuary have the picture in your bulletin. Things happened to two of the men in this picture that alerted me to the fact of thin places in my family's life. The one on the left is my father. The one next to him is my Uncle Wayne. And you can tell that my Uncle Wayne has Down syndrome. And it was things that happened first to Uncle Wayne and then to my father that made me aware of the thin places in our family's life. My family was very musical. My father was a fiddle player and a lead singer in a square dance band called the Keystone Pioneers. And they played for square dances every Saturday night in the community center in Sandy Lake, Pennsylvania. All the men in this picture except Wayne were in that band. Wayne, of course, was not in the band because in his era, when you had Down syndrome, you were kept at home. You didn't go to school. You weren't taught anything musically. You couldn't read music, but of course neither could any of the boys in the band read music. It didn't matter. He had the musical gift. And he would sit down at my grandmother's piano and he would chord on the piano and sing. And a change in chord meant a change in the melody. And I saw him often sitting at my grandmother's piano, chording and singing and using his musical gifts. When I first had enough consciousness to realize that there were other people in the world besides me and my two parents, Wayne was already I don't know what he was already doing. Radiation brain. Well, I knew Uncle Wayne for his whole life. And there was a distance of 20 years between when the first of the kids was born and Uncle Wayne was born. So when my grandparents died, all the members of the family, except Wayne, had already married and moved away. And Wayne was the only one left. And no one had a house that was more than very modest, and they couldn't take him in. So he was sent to the county home. And I was worried for him. He had never been away from the farm. He had never had anyone in his life except his brothers and sisters and grandparents. So I wondered, will he be treated well at the county home? Will he be liked there? And the reality was, they loved him. And he loved them. And I think he perked them up a little bit with his chording and playing. And he, for the first time, had family that weren't from the farm. I think he lived in that county home for probably 20 years. And after that, he got a very severe form of cancer. So he went to the hospital, and my mother accompanied him to the hospital. She would sit at his bedside, and he would sit propped up, and he watch the hospital TV. And what he wanted to watch was wrestling. But do you think there was wrestling on the hospital TV in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week? No, there was not. So my mother found an episode of Star Trek, and Wayne thought that the Star Trekkers' outfits looked enough like the outfits that wrestlers might have, and so he was content. He was sitting propped up there in the hospital room, and my mother was sitting there next to him, and he was looking at Star Trek and laughing and laughing. And then something happened that is so amazing. No one could have ever foreseen it coming. He was sitting up watching TV and laughing, and my mother was sitting next to him. And then he quit laughing. He turned to her, and she said there was a look of intelligence on his face that she had never seen before. The Down syndrome was gone. And he looked at her for perhaps 20 seconds, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, but the Down syndrome had gone. And then he looked back at the TV and started laughing, and the Down syndrome returned. So, what kind of world do we live in where that can happen? My mother was absolutely the right person to witness that, because she wasn't a Sewell, she was a Cheers. And yet she was kind of the rock of the family in times of trouble. If one of the boys in the band had been sitting there instead of my mother, he could have described the same event as accurately as she did, but he might not be believed. People might have said, well, I don't know. Because the reality is that you don't totally live down the reputation you created for yourself when you were young. And the boys in the band were all heavy drinkers. They were alcoholics. And they drove drunk. They drove with their family in the car drunk. They rode with their children in the car drunk. They were gallivanters and womanizers. They had affairs. They divorced their wives and married people they'd had a 2-year affair with. And then in their 40s, say, or early 50s, that was all past. They had all gone to AA, they had all sobered up. But you don't totally overcome that kind of a reputation. And Uncle Glenn could have totally described the situation accurately, and they would have said, well, I'm not so sure. So my mother was the right person for that. So, and when in their drunken days, they would do things like tell their wife they wanted a divorce because they had had a 2-year affair with a friend. There was one of them who was a serial one-night stander. You know, wherever he could find sex for one night, he took it. So you don't overcome that reputation. But when that kind of thing happened, say when the divorce happened, the woman who wasn't expecting a divorce, she would come to my mother, because my mother was the one that everyone trusted, that everyone knew was the rock of the family. And when any of those things happened, usually to the women, they would come to my mother. And my mother, they would know my mother would have compassion and understanding and maybe some suggestion for how life could go on. So it was usually the women, but once it was the man, after all the men had sobered up, the man had a good job in a factory, and he had planned on that job taking him through his whole career, and then the pension taking him through his retirement. And suddenly, unexpectedly, he was told he didn't have that job anymore. They were downsizing. And he came to my mother because he knew she was a thoughtful woman. She had a reasonable head on her shoulders, and he would get not only a compassionate response, but perhaps he would also get some suggestion on, okay, how can life go on after I've lost my job and I've lost my pension? Well, eventually Wayne died of the cancer. And my father then was diagnosed with stomach cancer, which, of course, is a slower move to death, but it will kill you. And so a bed was put downstairs for him in what had been the family room. And he slept downstairs at night, and my mother slept upstairs. And she would come down in the morning, and my father would say, Glenn came to see me last night. That would be my Uncle Glenn. And my mother would say, no, Glenn did not come to see you last night. You had a vivid dream that Glenn came to see you. But my father would say, no, he stood right there. It was so good to see him. And it gave me some assurance that when I die, I won't die alone. You know, that somebody will be there for me. And that went on. My mother would come down, and my father would say, Newt came to see me last night. That would be my Uncle Newt. And she would say, no, Newt did not come to see you last night. You had a vivid dream that Newt came to see you. But he would say, no, he stood right there, and we talked together, and it was so good to see him. And so I know that when I die, I won't die alone. And that went on for a while. And then my mother, perhaps it was because she remembered that astounding thing that had happened with Wayne when the Down syndrome disappeared and then reappeared. And so she stopped saying no, and she began to think, well, maybe it is true. If Down syndrome can appear and disappear, then maybe people do come to people who are getting nearer and nearer to death and visit with them before they die. Now, if she had had the advantage of reading the book Final Gifts, which is what our second reading was taken from today by the two hospice nurses, she would have read the testimony of the hospice nurses that yes, absolutely, people come to those who are close to death, most often friends or family, but it definitely happens that people do come. So my mother totally changed her mind. And then one day, she came down, and my father said, Wayne came to see me. And she said, did he still have Down syndrome? And my father said, you could tell that he used to have it. Now, I've thought about that. You could tell that he used to have it. If you have spent a long time with someone with Down syndrome, you know that they have a perspective that none of us can have who haven't had Down syndrome. And sometimes there's something in that perspective that is really good. So what I have thought that is, the Down syndrome is gone from Wayne now, but some of his insights that were really good remain. So I started thinking about, well, what happens when I die? What happens when you die? And I think what happens is that the things that were harmful to you, or the things that held you back, or the things that weren't the things that you were created for, the things that maybe just weren't very nice or weren't very good. And I'm actually going to say now that I'm going to talk about Ginny. Not that she has anything that's not very good about her. I want to get that clear. But when I need help sometimes, and I ask Ginny to come and help me, and she's doing something else, she sometimes doesn't come right when I want her to come. She comes on her schedule, not mine. And because she hasn't come on my schedule, I start getting a little impatient, and then I start getting a little angry, grumpy. Grumpy, she says. I start getting a little grumpy. And those are things about me that aren't good. Things that I won't have in heaven, along with that walker and radiation brain. You know, those are things that are gone, and things that are actually good about me are things that God has been pleased about. Those will be fulfilled. And I think the same thing that I'm talking about me, I think that happens to you when you die. And I think it actually happens to every person who dies. The things that are hurtful or have held you back or have been not that nice, those things you're freed from. And the things about you that are admirable and good and pleasing to God, those things are fulfilled. So, every time I tell a story like this, like these ones I've told, though I haven't done it often outside of now, someone will come up to me afterward and say, I want to tell you a story. And it'll be a story about something between that person and God, or that person and heaven, or that person and angels even, that they have been reluctant to tell in the past. And I have taken note of that reluctance. I think it's in all of us. I think we don't want to tell the things that people might think, well, that's kind of weird, or that's kind of strange. And so what I have decided is that we need to face that reluctance. And so when I started preparing this sermon, I had no idea that this was going to be the ending of it. But the ending is that I'm going to give you an assignment. And the assignment is, when you leave today, when you get in your car to go home, if you're in a car full of people, be someone who is the brave one, who first tells a story about God or heaven or angels or something that you have been reluctant to tell in the past. And if you're in a car full, you be the first, and then there will be then a second and a third till everyone has told a story that they have been reluctant to tell in the past. And if you come here alone, but you always sit in a row of the same 3 people, then don't drive out of the parking lot alone today. Park 2 cars and go out together to a coffee or lunch and tell each other, tell the 3 of you the same, you have the same assignment. Tell something that you have been reluctant to tell, but now you're willing to tell. And if you came early because you wanted the children upstairs early and your husband came later, so you have 2 cars, well then, as you're driving home, if the children aren't distracting, then kind of go inside your own head and rehearse a story that you have not told before because it might make you feel weird. And if you have absolutely no one, then rehearse your story to yourself, and then go and find someone that you know will respond positively, that you know will believe you. And tell them what the church is doing, this assignment that I'm giving you all. And say, I want to tell you a story about me and God or whatever. And then say, do you have a story that reminds you of? And if you are sitting there thinking, I can't think of a story, then my suggestion would be, ask the Spirit of God to remind you. Ask the Spirit of God to help you remember. I think if we can successfully complete this assignment in the next week, what might happen is that there might be more joy in our congregation because we have been more willing to share with each other. I'm not saying that there's not a lot of joy already. I'm not saying that we're going to have testimonial time in all the weeks ahead. That's not what's going to happen. But we can somehow add to our joy just because we trusted each other enough to share with each other. Sometimes when Jennifer ends a sermon, she says, remember what she says? She says, let it be so. Right, Jennifer?
Once in a while.
Once in a very long time, Jennifer will say, let it be so. So I want to end the sermon the way she does. let it be so. And then I'm going to add, Lord, let it be so. Lord, Lord, let it be so. Amen.